Before he reached Mount Solon, Jackson had instructed Ewell to call up Branch's brigade from Gordonsville. He intended to follow Banks with the whole force at his disposal, and in these dispositions Lee had acquiesced. Johnston, however, now at Richmond, had once more resumed charge of the detached forces, and a good deal of confusion ensued. Lee, intent on threatening Washington, was of opinion that Banks should be attacked. Johnston, although at first he favoured such a movement, does not appear to have realised the effect that might be produced by an advance to the Potomac. Information had been received that Banks was constructing entrenchments at Strasburg, and Johnston changed his mind. He thought the attack too hazardous, and Ewell was directed to cross the Blue Ridge and march eastward, while Jackson observed Banks. These orders placed Ewell in a dilemma. Under instructions from Lee, he was to remain with Jackson. Under instructions from Jackson, he was already moving on Luray. Johnston's orders changed his destination. Taking horse in haste, he rode across the valley from Swift Run Gap to Jackson's camp at Mount Solon. Jackson at once telegraphed to Lee, "I am of opinion that an attempt should be made to defeat Banks, but under instructions from General Johnston I do not feel at liberty to make an attack. Please answer by telegraph at once." To Ewell he gave orders that he should suspend his movement until a reply was received. "As you are in the Valley District," he wrote, "you constitute part of my command. You will please move so as to encamp between Newmarket and Mount Jackson on next Wednesday night, unless you receive orders from a superior officer and of a date subsequent to the 16th instant." This order was written at Ewell's own suggestion. It was for this he had ridden through the night to Jackson's camp. May 18th. Lee's reply was satisfactory. Johnston had already summoned Branch to Richmond, but Ewell was to remain. And the next morning, May 18th, the Confederates moved forward down the valley. The 2 days' rest which had been granted to Jackson's troops had fallen at a useful time. They had marches to look back on which had tried their endurance to the utmost. In 3 days, before and after Kernstown, they had covered 56 miles and had fought a severe engagement. The struggle with the mud on the Port Republic was only surpassed by the hardships of the march to Romney. From Elk Run to Franklin, and from Franklin to Mount Solon, is just 200 miles, and these they had traversed in 18 days. But the exertions which had been then demanded from them were trifling in comparison with those which were to come. From Mount Solon to Winchester is 80 miles by the Valley Pike, to Harper's Ferry 110 miles. And Jackson had determined that before many days had passed, the Confederate colours should be carried in triumph through the streets of Winchester, and that the gleam of his campfires should be reflected in the waters of the Potomac. Johnston believed that Banks, behind the earthworks at Strasburg, was securely sheltered. Jackson saw that his enemy had made a fatal mistake, and that his earthworks, skilfully and strongly constructed as they were no more than a snare and a delusion. Ashby had already moved to Newmarket, and a strong cordon of pickets extended along Pugh's Run near Woodstock, within sight of the Federal outposts and cutting off all communication between Strasburg and the Upper Valley. Ewell's cavalry regiments, the 2nd and 6th Virginia, held the Luray Valley with a detachment east of the Blue Ridge. May 20th. On the 20th, Jackson arrived at Newmarket, 30 miles from Mount Solon. Ewell had meanwhile marched to Luray, and the 2 wings were now on either side of the Massanuttons. On his way to Newmarket, Jackson had been joined by the Louisiana Brigade of Ewell's division. This detachment seems to have been made with the view of inducing Banks to believe, should information filter through Ashby's pickets, that the whole Confederate force was advancing direct on Strasburg. The Army of the Valley numbered nearly 17,000 officers and men. Ewell's effective strength was 7,500, Johnson's 2,500, Jackson's 6,000, and there were 11 batteries. The troops were now organised in 2 divisions, Jackson's division. First, Stonewall Brigade, General Winder, 2nd Virginia, 4th Virginia, 5th Virginia, 27th Virginia, 33rd Virginia. 2nd Brigade, Colonel Campbell, 21st Virginia, 42nd Virginia, 48th Virginia, 1st Regulars, Irish. 3rd Brigade, Colonel Taliaferro, 10th Virginia, 23rd Virginia, 37th Virginia. Cavalry, Colonel Ashby, 7th Virginia. Artillery, 5 batteries, 1 horse artillery, 22 guns. Ewell's Division. Taylor's Brigade, 6th Louisiana, 7th Louisiana, 8th Louisiana, 9th Louisiana, Wheat's Battalion, Louisiana Tigers. Trimble's Brigade, 21st North Carolina, 21st Georgia, 15th Alabama, 16th Mississippi. Elsey's Brigade and Scott's Brigade, 13th Virginia, 31st Virginia, 25th Virginia, 12th Georgia, late Johnson's, 44th Virginia, 52nd Virginia, 58th Virginia. For the first time in his career, Jackson found himself in command of a considerable force. The greater part of the troops were Virginians, and with these he was personally acquainted. The strange contingents were Taylor's and Trimble's brigades, and Stuart's cavalry. These had yet to be broken to his methods of war and discipline. There was no reason, however, to fear that they would prove less efficient than his own division. They had as yet seen little fighting, but they were well commanded. Ewell was a most able soldier, full of dash and daring, who had seen much service on the Indian frontier. He was an admirable subordinate, ready to take responsibility if orders were not forthcoming, and executing his instructions to the letter. His character was original. His modesty was only equalled by his eccentricity. Trimble, too, was a good officer, an able tactician, and a resolute leader. He had hardly, however, realized as yet that the movements of a brigade must be subordinated to those of the whole army, and he was wont to grumble if his troops were held back or were not allowed to pursue some local success. Stuart was also a West Pointer, but with much to learn. Taylor and his Louisianians played so important a part in the ensuing operations that they deserve more detailed mention. The command was a mixed one. One of the regiments had been recruited from the roughs of New Orleans. The 7th and 9th were composed of planters and sons of planters, the majority of them men of fortune. The 6th were Irishmen, stout, hardy fellows, turbulent in camp and requiring a strong hand, but responding to justice and kindness, and ready to follow their officers to the death. The 8th were from the Attakapas, Acadians, the race of whom Longfellow sings in Evangeline, a home-loving, simple people. Few spoke English, fewer still had ever moved 10 miles from their native cabanas, and the war to them was a liberal education. They had all the light gaiety of the Gaul, and, after the manner of their ancestors, were born cooks. A capital regimental band accompanied them, and whenever weather and ground permitted, even after long marches, they would waltz and poke in couples with as much zest as if their arms encircled the supple waists of the Celestines and Melazes of their native Teche. The valley soldiers were largely of the Presbyterian faith and of a solemn, pious demeanour, and looked askance at the caperings of my Creoles, holding them to be devices and snares. Taylor himself had been educated at West Point. He was a man of high position, of unquestioned ability, an excellent disciplinarian and a delightful writer. More than other commanders, he had paid great attention to the marching of his men. He had an eye for those practical details which a good regimental officer enforces with so much effect. Boots were properly fitted. The troops were taught the advantages of cold water and how to heal abrasions. Halts upon the march were made at frequent intervals, and the men soon held that to fall out on the march was a disgrace. Before a month had passed, he says, the brigade had learned how to march, and in the valley with Jackson covered long distances without leaving a straggler behind. Jackson's first meeting with the Louisiana troops has been described by their commander. A mounted officer was dispatched to report our approach and select a camp, which proved to be beyond Jackson's forces, then lying in the fields on both sides of the valley pike. Over 3,000 strong, neat in fresh clothing of grey with white gaiters, bands playing at the head of their regiments, not a straggler, but every man in his place, stepping jauntily as if on parade, though it had marched 20 miles or more, in open column, with the rays of the declining sun flaming on polished bayonets, the brigade moved down the hard, smooth pike and wheeled onto the camping ground. Jackson's men, by thousands, had gathered on either side of the road to see us pass. After attending to necessary camp details, I sought Jackson, whom I had never met. The mounted officer who had been sent on in advance pointed out a figure perched on the topmost rail of a fence overlooking the road and field, and said it was Jackson. Approaching, I saluted and declared my name and rank, then waited for a response. Before this came, I had time to see a pair of cavalry boots covering feet of gigantic size, a mangy cap with visor drawn low, a heavy dark beard and weary eyes I afterwards saw filled with intense but never brilliant light. A low, gentle voice inquired the road and distance marched that day. "Keeselton Road, 26 miles. You seem to have no stragglers. Never allow straggling. You must teach my people. They straggle badly." A bow in reply. Just then my Creoles started their band for a waltz. After a contemplative suck at a lemon, thoughtless fellows for serious work came forth. I expressed a hope that the work would not be less well done because of the gaiety. A return to the lemon gave me the opportunity to retire. Where Jackson got his lemons, no fellow could find out, but he was rarely without one. To have lived 12 miles from that fruit would have disturbed him as much as it did the witty dean. May 24. The next day, marching in the grey of the morning, the force moved north, the Louisianians in advance. Suddenly, after covering a short distance, the head of the column was turned to the right, and the troops, who had confidently expected that Strasbourg would be the scene of their next engagement, found themselves moving eastward and crossing the Massanuttons. The men were utterly at sea as to the intentions of their commander. Taylor's brigade had been encamped near Conrad's store, only a few miles distant, not many days before, and they had now to solve the problem why they should have made 3 long marches in order to return to their former position. No word came from Jackson to enlighten them. From time to time a courier would gallop up, report, and return to Luray, but the general, absorbed in thought, rode silently across the mountain, perfectly oblivious of inquiring glances. At Newmarket the troops had been halted at crossroads, and they had marched by that which they had least expected. The camp at Luray on the 21st presented the same puzzle. One road ran east across the mountains to Warrenton or Culpeper, a second north to Front Royal and Winchester, and the men said that halting them in such a position was an ingenious device of Jackson's to prevent them fathoming his plans. May 22nd. The next day, the 22nd, the army, with Ewell leading, moved quietly down the Luray Valley, and the advanced guard, Taylor's Louisianians, a 6-pounder battery, and the 6th Virginia Cavalry, bivouacked that night within 10 miles of Front Royal, held by a strong detachment of Banks's small army. Since they had left Mount Solon and Elk Run Valley on May 19th, the troops, in 4 days, had made just 60 miles. Such celerity of movement was unfamiliar to both Banks and Stanton, and on the night of the 22nd, neither the Secretary nor the General had the faintest suspicion that the enemy had as yet passed Harrisonburg. There was serenity at Washington. On both sides of the Blue Ridge everything was going well. The attack on Fremont had not been followed up, and McClellan, though calling urgently for reinforcements, was sanguine of success. Mr. Lincoln, reassured by Jackson's retreat from Franklin, had permitted Shields to march to Falmouth, and McDowell, with a portion of his troops, had already crossed the Rappahannock. The president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, an important personage at Washington, appears to have been alone in his apprehension that a storm was gathering in the summer sky. "The aspect of affairs in the Valley of Virginia," he wrote to Stanton, "is becoming very threatening. The enterprise and vigour of Jackson are well known. Under the circumstances, will it not be more judicious to order back General Shields to cooperate with General Banks? Such a movement might be accomplished in time to prevent disaster. The secretary, however, saw no reason for alarm. His strategical combinations were apparently working without a hitch. Banks at Strasbourg was in a strong position, and McDowell was about to lend the aid which would enable McClellan to storm the rebel capital. One of Fremont's columns, under General Cox, a most able officer, which was making good progress towards the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, had certainly been compelled to halt when Milroy was driven back to Franklin. Yet the defeated troops were rapidly reorganizing, and Fremont would soon resume his movement. Milroy's defeat was considered no more than an incident of la petite guerre. Washington seemed so perfectly secure that the recruiting offices had been closed, and the President and Secretary, anticipating the immediate fall of Richmond, left for Fredericksburg the next day. McDowell was to march on the 26th, and the departure of his fine army was to be preceded by a grand review. Even Banks, though Shields had marched to Fredericksburg, reducing his force by a half, believed that there was no immediate reason to fear attack. "I regard it as certain," he wrote, "that Jackson will move north as far as New Market, a position which enables him to cooperate with General Ewell, who is still at Swift Run Gap." Yet he took occasion to remind Mr. Stanton of the persistent adherence of Jackson to the defense of the valley and his well-known purpose to expel the government troops. "This," he added, "may be assumed as certain. There is probably no one more fixed and determined purpose in the whole circle of the enemy's plans." Banks had certainly learned something of Jackson by this time, but he did not yet know all. So on this night of May 22nd, the President and his people were without fear of what the morrow might bring forth. The end of the rebellion seemed near at hand. Washington was full of the anticipated triumph. The crowds passed to and fro in the broad avenues, exchanging congratulations on the success of the Northern arms and the approaching downfall of the slaveholders. The theatres were filled with delighted audiences who hailed every scoffing allusion to the Southern chivalry with enthusiasm, and gaiety and confidence reigned supreme. Little dreamt the light-hearted multitude that in the silent woods of the Luray Valley a Confederate army lay asleep beneath the stars. Little dreamt Lincoln or Banks or Stanton that not more than 70 miles from Washington and less than 30 from Strasbourg, the most daring of their enemies, waiting for the dawn to rise above the mountains, was pouring out his soul in prayer, appealing from his native sod in forma pauperis to God, "Lay bare thine arm, stretch forth thy rod. Amen." That's Stonewall's way. It is not always joy that cometh in the morning, least of all to generals as ignorant as Banks when they have to do with a skilful foe. It was not altogether Banks' fault that his position was a bad one. Stanton had given him a direct order to take post at Strasbourg or its vicinity, and to send 2 regiments to hold the bridges at Front Royal. But Banks had made no remonstrance. He had either failed to recognize, until it was too late, that the force at Front Royal would be exposed to attack from the Luray Valley, and, if the post fell, that his own communications with both Winchester and Washington would be at once endangered, or he had lost favour with the Secretary. For some time past, Mr. Stanton's telegrams had been cold and peremptory. There had been no more effusive praise of cautious vigour and interesting manoeuvres, and Banks had gradually fallen from the command of a large army corps to the charge of a single division. His 10,000 men were thus distributed. At Strasbourg were 4,500 infantry, 2,900 cavalry, and 16 guns. At Winchester, 850 infantry and 600 cavalry. 2 companies of infantry held Buckton Station on the Manassas Gap Railway, midway between Strasbourg and Front Royal. At Rectortown, east of the Blue Ridge, 19 miles from Front Royal, was General Geary with 2,000 infantry and cavalry. These troops, however, were independent of Banks. Front Royal, 12 miles east of Strasbourg, was committed to the charge of Colonel Kenly, of the 1st Maryland Regiment in the Federal service, and 1,000 rifles and 2 guns were placed at his disposal. The post itself was indefensible. To the west and southwest, about 3 miles distant, stand the green peaks of the Massanuttons, while to the east the lofty spurs of the Blue Ridge look down into the village streets. A mile and a half north, the forks of the Shenandoah unite in the broad river that runs to Harper's Ferry. The turnpike to Winchester crosses both forks in succession, at a point where they are divided by a stretch of meadows a mile in width. In addition to these two bridges, a wooden viaduct carried the railway over the South Fork, whence, passing between the North Fork and the Massanuttons, it runs south of the stream to Strasburg. Kenly had pitched his camp between the town and the river, covering the bridges, and two companies were on picket beyond the houses. In front were the dense forests which fill the Luray Valley and cover the foothills of the mountains, and the view of the Federal sentries was very limited. A strong patrol of 100 infantry and 30 troopers, which had been sent out on the 20th, had marched 11 miles south, had bivouacked in the woods, and had captured a Confederate straggler. The officer in command had obtained information by questioning civilians that Confederate infantry was expected, and this was confirmed by his prisoner. Banks, however, notwithstanding this report, could not bring himself to believe that an attack was imminent, and the cavalry was called back to Strasburg. For this reason, Kenly had been unable to patrol to any distance on the 22nd, and the security of his camp was practically dependent on the vigilance of his sentries. May 23. On the morning of May 23rd, there was no token of the approaching storm. The day was intensely hot, and the blue masses of the mountains shimmered in the summer haze. In the Luray Valley to the south was no sign of life, save the buzzards sailing lazily above the slumbrous woods. Suddenly, and without the least warning, a long line of skirmishers broke forward from the forest. The clear notes of the Confederate bugles, succeeded by the crash of musketry, woke the echoes of the Blue Ridge, and the Federal pickets were driven in confusion through the village. The long roll of the drums beat the startled camp to arms, and Kenly hastily drew up his slender force upon a ridge in rear. The ground in front of his position was fairly open, and with his two pieces of artillery he was able to check the first rush of the Confederate infantry. The guns which had accompanied their advanced guard were only smoothbores, and it was some time before a battery capable of making effective reply to the Federal pieces was brought up. As soon as it opened fire, the Southern infantry was ordered to attack, and while one regiment, working round through the woods on the enemy's left, endeavoured to outflank his guns, 4 others, in successive lines, advanced across the plain against his front. The Federals, undismayed by the disparity of numbers, were fighting bravely, and had just been reinforced by a squadron of New York regiment when word was brought to their commander that a regiment of Southern cavalry had appeared between the rivers to his right rear. He at once gave the order to retire. The movement was carried out in good order, under heavy musketry, and the tents and stores were given to the flames. But an attempt to fire the bridges failed, for the Louisiana infantry, rushing recklessly forward, darted into the flames and extinguished the burning brands. Sufficient damage was done, however, to render the passage of the North Fork by the Confederates slow and difficult, and Kenly took post on Guard Hill, a commanding ridge beyond the stream. Again there was delay. The smoke of the burning camp, rolling past in dense volumes, formed an impenetrable screen. The river was deep and turbulent, with a strong current, and the Federal guns commanded the single bridge. The cavalry, however, were not long in discovering a practicable ford. The river was soon alive with horsemen, and forcing their way through the swirling waters, 4 squadrons of the 6th Virginia, accompanied by Jackson, gained the further bank and formed up rapidly for pursuit. The enemy had already retired, and the dust of the retreating column warned receding fast down the road to Winchester. Without waiting for reinforcements and without artillery, Jackson urged the 6th Virginia forward. The country through which the turnpike runs is rolling and well farmed, and the rail fences on either hand made movement across the fields by no means easy. But the Confederate advance was vigorous. The New York cavalry, pressed at every point, were beginning to waver, and near the little hamlet of Cedarville, some 3 miles from his last position, Kenly gave orders for his infantry to check the pursuit. The column had halted. Men were tearing down the fences, and the companies were forming for battle in the fields, when there was a sudden outcry, the rolling thunder of many hoofs, and the sharp rattle of pistol shots. A dense cloud of dust came whirling down the turnpike, and emerging from the yellow canopy, the New York troopers, riding for their lives, dashed through the ranks of the startled infantry, while the Confederate horsemen, extending far to right and left, came surging on their traces. The leading squadron, keeping to the high road, was formed four abreast, and the deep mass was wedged tightly between the fences. The foremost files were mowed down by a volley at close range, and here, for a moment, the attack was checked. But the Virginians meant riding home. On either flank the supporting squadrons galloped swiftly forward and up the road and across the fields, while the earth shook beneath their tread, swept their charging lines, the men yelling in their excitement and horses as frenzied as their riders. In vain the Federal officers tried to deploy their companies. Kenly, calling on them to rally round the colours, was cut down with a dreadful wound. The grey troopers fell on them before they could fix bayonets or form a front, and sabre and revolver found an easy mark in the crowded masses of panic-stricken infantry. One of the guns was surrounded, and the gunners were cut to pieces. The other escaped for the moment, but was soon abandoned, and with the appearance of a fresh Confederate squadron on the scene, Kenly's whole force dispersed in flight. Through woods and orchards the chase went on. Escape was impossible. Hundreds laid down their arms, and 250 Virginia horsemen, resolutely handled and charging at exactly the right moment, had the honour of bringing in as prisoners 600 Federals, including 20 officers and a complete section of artillery. The enemy lost in addition 32 killed and 122 wounded. The Confederate casualties were 11 killed and 15 wounded, and so sudden and vigorous was their attack that a Federal colonel estimated their numbers at 3,000. Colonel Flournoy, a most daring officer, led the squadrons to the charge, but that the opportunity was so instantly utilised was due to Jackson. No sooner, says Dabney, did he see the enemy than he gave the order to charge with a voice and air whose peremptory determination was communicated to the whole party. His quick eye estimated aright the discouragement of the Federals and their wavering temper. Infusing his own spirit into his men, he struck the hesitating foe at the decisive moment and shattered them. Yet he took no credit to himself. He declared afterward to his staff that he had never, in all his experience of warfare, seen so gallant and effective a charge of cavalry, and such commendation, coming from his guarded lips, was the highest honour that his troopers could have wished. While these events were in progress, the remainder of the Confederate cavalry had also been busy. The 7th Virginia had moved to Buckton, the railway was torn up, the telegraph line cut, and an urgent message to Banks for reinforcements was intercepted. The 2 companies of Pennsylvania infantry, on picket near the station, occupied a log storehouse and the embankment. Dismounting his command, Ashby, after a fierce fight, in which 2 of his best officers were killed, stormed the building and drove out the garrison. 2 locomotives were standing on the rails with steam up, and by this means the Federals attempted to escape. Twice they moved out towards Strasburg, twice they were driven back by the Confederate carbines, and eventually the 2 companies surrendered. Jackson's measures had been carefully thought out. Kenly's patrols had failed to discover his advance in the early morning, for at Asbury Chapel, about 3.5 miles south of the Federal outpost line, he had turned to the right off the Luray Road, and plunging into the woods, had approached Front Royal by a circuitous track, so rough that the enemy had thought it hardly worthwhile to watch it. The main body of the cavalry left the Luray Road at McCoy's Ford, and crossing the south fork of the Shenandoah, worked through the forest at the foot of the Massanuttons. During the night, Ashby had withdrawn the 7th Virginia, with the exception of a few patrols, from in front of Banks, and joining Jackson by a rough track across the mountains before daybreak, had been directed to cut the communication between Front Royal and Strasburg. The 6th Virginia had accompanied Jackson, the 2nd, under Colonel Munford, destroyed the railway bridges eastward of Front Royal. Had Kenly retreated on Strasburg, he would have found Ashby on his flank. Had reinforcements been dispatched from Strasbourg, they would have had to deal with Ashby before they could reach Kenley. Had the Federals attempted to escape by Manassas Gap, they would have found Munford across their path. Meanwhile, another party of cavalry had cut the telegraph between Front Royal and Washington, and a strong detachment, scouring the country east of the Blue Ridge, checked Geary's patrols and blocked the entrance to the gap from the direction of Manassas. Within an hour after his pickets were surprised Kenley was completely isolated. A failure in staff duties marred to some extent the Confederate success. A vicious usage, according to Dabney, obtained at this time in the Southern armies. This was the custom of temporarily attaching to the staff of a general, commanding a division or an army a company of cavalry to do the work of orderlies. By this clumsy contrivance, the organization of the cavalry regiments was broken up, the men detached were deprived of all opportunity for drill, and the general had no evidence whatever of their special fitness for the responsible service confided to them. Nay, the colonel of cavalry required to furnish them was most likely to select the least serviceable company. At the time of the combat of Front Royal, the duty of orderlies was performed for General Jackson by a detachment from one of Ashby's undisciplined companies, of whom many were raw youths just recruited and never under fire. As soon as the Federal pickets were driven in, orders were dispatched to the rear brigades to avoid the laborious route taken by the advance and to pursue the direct highway to the town, a level track of 3 miles, in place of a steep byway of 7 or 8. The panic-struck boy by whom the orders were sent was seen no more. When Jackson sent orders to the artillery and rear brigades to hurry the pursuit, instead of being found near at hand upon the direct road, they were at length overtaken, toiling over the hills of the useless circuit, spent with the protracted march. Thus night overtook them by the time they reached the village. This unfortunate incident taught the necessity of a picked company of orderlies, selected for their intelligence and courage, permanently attached to headquarters, and owing no subordination to any other than the general and his staff. Such was the usage that afterwards prevailed in the Confederate armies. General Gordon has described with much minuteness how the news of the disaster was received at Strasbourg. The attack had begun at 1 o'clock, but it was not till 4 that Banks was made aware that his detachment was in jeopardy. Believing that Jackson was at Harrisonburg, 60 miles distant, he had certainly no cause for immediate apprehension. The valley towards Woodstock never looked more peaceful than on that sleepy summer afternoon. The sentries dawdled on their posts, and officers and men alike resigned themselves to its restful influence. Suddenly a mounted orderly dashed violently through the camp, and Strasbourg was aroused. By the road to Buckton Banks hastily dispatched a regiment and 2 guns. Then came a lull, and many anxious inquiries. What is it? Is it Stonewall Jackson, or only a cavalry raid? A few hours later, reports came in from the field of battle, and Banks telegraphed to Stanton that 5,000 rebels had driven Kenley back on Middletown. The force, he added, has been gathering in the mountains, it is said, since Wednesday. But still, the Federal general showed no undue alarm. Nothing was done, says Gordon, towards sending away to Winchester any of the immense quantities of public stores collected at Strasbourg. No movement had been made to place our sick in safety. It did not seem as if Banks interpreted the attack to signify aught of future or further movement by the enemy, or that it betokened any purpose to cut us off from Winchester. I was so fully impressed, however, with Jackson's purpose that as soon as night set in I sought Banks at his headquarters. I laboured long to impress upon him what I thought a duty, to wit his immediate retreat upon Winchester, carrying all his sick and all his supplies that he could transport, and destroying the remainder. Notwithstanding all my solicitations and entreaties, he persistently refused to move, ever repeating, "I must develop the force of the enemy." The force that had been sent out on the Buckton Road had been soon recalled, without securing further information than that the Confederate pickets were in possession of every road which led west or north from Front Royal. Again did Gordon, at the request of Banks' chief of the staff, endeavour to persuade the general to abandon Strasbourg. "It is not a retreat," he urged, "but a true military movement to escape from being cut off, to prevent stores and sick from falling into the hands of the enemy." Moved with an unusual fire, General Banks, who had met all my arguments with the single reply, "I must develop the force of the enemy," rising excitedly from his seat, with much warmth and in loud tones exclaimed, "By God, sir, I will not retreat. We have more to fear, sir, from the opinions of our friends than the bayonets of our enemies." The thought, continues the brigadier, so long the subject of his meditations was at last out. Banks was afraid of being thought afraid. I rose to take my leave, replying, "This, sir, is not a military reason for occupying a false position." It was 11 o'clock at night when I left him. As I returned through the town, I could not perceive that anybody was troubled with anticipation for the morrow. The antlers were driving sharp bargains with those who had escaped from, or those who were not amenable to military discipline. The strolling players were moving crowds to noisy laughter in their canvas booths, through which the lights gleamed and the music sounded with startling shrillness. I thought, as I turned towards my camp, how unaware are all of the drama Jackson is preparing for us, and what merriment the morning will reveal. Fortunately for his own battalions, the brigadier had his camp equipage and baggage packed and sent off then and there to Winchester, and though his men had to spend the night unsheltered under persistent rain, they had reason to bless his foresight a few nights later. At midnight a report was received from one of the Front Royal fugitives. "Kenly is killed. 1st Maryland cut to pieces. Cavalry ditto. The enemy's forces are 15,000 or 20,000 strong, and on the march to Strasburg." In forwarding this dispatch to Washington, Banks remarked that he thought it much exaggerated. At 7 a.m. on the 24th, he told Stanton that the enemy's force was from 6,000 to 10,000, that it was probably Ewell's division, and that Jackson was still in his front on the Valley Turnpike. 3 hours later, he wrote to Gordon, informing him that the enemy had fallen back to Front Royal during the night, that ample reinforcements had been promised from Washington, and that the division would remain in Strasburg until further orders. Up to this time he had been convinced that the attack on Front Royal was merely a raid, and that Jackson would never dare to insert his whole force between himself and McDowell. Suddenly, by what means we are not told, he was made aware that the Confederates were in overwhelming numbers, and that Jackson was in command. Scarcely had General Gordon digested the previous communication when an orderly, galloping furiously to his side, delivered a pencil note from the Chief of Staff. "Orders have just been received for the division to move at once to Middletown, taking such steps to oppose the enemy, reported to be on the road between Front Royal and Middletown, as may seem proper." Banks was electrified at last. 3 weeks previously, in writing to Mr. Stanton, he had expressed his regret that he was not to be included in active operations during the summer. His regret was wasted. He was about to take part in operations of which the activity, on his part at least, was more than satisfying. Such blindness as Banks had shown is difficult to explain. His latest information, previous to the attack on Kenly, told him that Jackson's trains were arriving at Harrisonburg on the 20th, and he should certainly have inferred that Jackson was in advance of his wagons. Now from Harrisonburg across the Massanuttons to Front Royal is 55 miles, so it was well within the bounds of possibility that the Confederates might reach the latter village at midday on the 23rd. Moreover, Banks himself had recognized that Strasburg was an unfavorable position. It is true that it was fortified, but therein lay the very reason that would induce the enemy to turn it by Front Royal. Nor did the idea, which seems to have held possession of his mind throughout the night, that Ewell alone had been sent to destroy Kenly, and had afterwards fallen back, show much strategic insight. Front Royal was the weak point in the Federal position. It was of all things unlikely that a commander, energetic and skillful as Jackson was well known to be, would, when he had once advertised his presence, fail to follow up his first blow with his whole force and the utmost vigour. It is only fair to add that the Federal authorities were no wiser than their general. At 2 a.m. on the morning of the 24th, although the news of Kenly's disaster had been fully reported, they still thought that there was time to move fresh troops to Strasbourg from Baltimore and Washington. It seemed incredible that Jackson could be at Front Royal. "Arrangements are making," ran Stanton's telegram to Banks, "to send you ample reinforcements. Do not give up the ship before succour can arrive." We may now turn to Jackson. Up to the present, his operations had been perfectly successful. He had captured over 700 of the enemy, with a loss of only 40 or 50 to himself. He had seized stores to the value of $300,000, £60,000, and a large quantity had been burned by the enemy. He had turned the entrenched position at Strasbourg. He threatened the federal line of retreat. Banks was completely at his mercy, and there seemed every prospect of inflicting on that ill-starred commander a defeat so decisive as to spread panic in the council chambers of the northern capital. But the problem was not so simple as it seemed. In the first place, although the positions of the Federals had been thoroughly examined, both by staff officers and scouts, the information as to their numbers was somewhat vague. Banks had actually about 8,000 effectives at Strasbourg, but so far as the Confederates knew, it was quite possible that he had from 12,000 to 15,000. There is nothing more difficult in war than to get an accurate estimate of the enemy's numbers, especially when civilians, ignorant of military affairs, are the chief sources of information. The agents on whom Jackson depended for intelligence from within the enemy's lines were not always selected because of their military knowledge. "On the march to Front Royal," says General Taylor, "we reached a wood extending from the mountain to the river, when a mounted officer from the rear called Jackson's attention, who rode back with him. A moment later there rushed out of the wood a young, rather well-looking woman, afterwards widely known as Belle Boyd. Breathless with speed and agitation, some time elapsed before she found her voice. Then, with much volubility, she said we were near Front Royal, that the town was filled with Federals, whose camp was on the west side of the river, where they had guns in position to cover the bridge, that they believed Jackson to be west of the Massanuttons, near Harrisonburg, that General Banks was at Winchester, where he was concentrating his widely scattered forces to meet Jackson's advance, which was expected some days later. All this she told with the precision of a staff officer making a report, and it was true to the letter. Jackson was possessed of this information before he left Newmarket and based his movements on it, but it was news to me. In the second place, Banks had still the means of escape. He could hardly prevent the Confederates from seizing Winchester, but he might at least save his army from annihilation. Jackson's men were exhausted and the horses jaded. Since the morning of the 19th, the whole army had marched over 80, and Ewell's division over 90 miles. And this average of 17 miles a day had been maintained on rough and muddy roads, crossed by many unbridged streams, and over a high mountain. The day which had just passed had been especially severe. Ewell, who was in bivouac at Cedarville, 5 miles north of Front Royal on the Winchester, the march to Middletown 328 Turnpike, had marched more than 20 miles, and Jackson's own division, which had made 24, was on foot from 5 in the morning till 9 at night. Banks' natural line of retreat led through Winchester, and the Confederate advanced guard at Cedarville was 2 miles nearer that town than were the Federals at Strasbourg. But it was still possible that Banks, warned by Kenly's overthrow, might withdraw by night, and even if he deferred retreat until daylight, he might, instead of falling back on Winchester, strike boldly for Front Royal and escape by Manassas Gap. Or lastly, he might remain at Strasbourg, at which point he was in communication, although by a long and circuitous road, with Fremont at Franklin. Jackson had therefore 3 contingencies to provide against, and during the night which followed the capture of Front Royal, he evolved a plan which promised to meet them all. Ashby, at daybreak, was to move with the 7th Virginia Cavalry in the direction of Strasbourg, and at the same hour a staff officer, with a small escort, supported by Taylor's Louisianians, was to ride towards Middletown, a village 5 miles north of Strasbourg and 13 from Winchester, and to report frequently. the 2nd and 6th Virginia Cavalry, under General Stuart, were to advance to Newtown, also on the Valley Turnpike and 8 miles from Winchester, while Ewell, with Trimble's brigade and his artillery, was to move to Nineveh, 2 miles north of Cedarville, and there halt, awaiting orders. The remainder of the command was to concentrate at Cedarville, preparatory to marching on Middletown, and strong cavalry patrols were to keep close watch on the Strasburg to Front Royal Road. 6 a.m. from Cedarville to Middletown is no more than 7 miles, and Taylor's brigade is reported to have moved at 6 a.m., while Ashby had presumably already marched. But notwithstanding the fact that Banks' infantry did not leave Strasburg till 10 a.m., and that it had 5 miles to cover before reaching Middletown, when the Confederates reached the turnpike at that village the Federal main body had already passed, and only the rear guard was encountered. It seems evident, therefore, that it was not till near noon that Jackson's patrols came in sight of Middletown, and that the Confederate advanced guard had taken at least 6 hours to cover 7 miles. The country, however, between Cedarville and the Valley Turnpike was almost a continuous forest, and wood fighting is very slow fighting. The advance had met with strong resistance. General Gordon had prudently sent the 29th Pennsylvania to Middletown at an early hour, with orders to reconnoitre towards Front Royal and to cover Middletown until the army had passed through. 7 a.m., supported by a section of artillery, the regiment had moved eastward till it struck the Confederate scouts some 4 miles out on the Cedarville Road. After a long skirmish, it was withdrawn to Middletown. But the 1st Maine Cavalry and a squadron of the 1st Vermont, about 400 strong, which had been ordered by Banks to proceed in the same direction, made a vigorous demonstration, and then fell back slowly before the advanced guard, showing a bold front, using their carbines freely, and taking advantage of the woods to impose upon the enemy. 10:15 a.m. These manoeuvres succeeded in holding the Confederates in check till after 10 o'clock, for the heavy timber concealed the real strength of the Federals, and although Ashby with the 7th Virginia had marched to the scene of action, the infantry was not yet up. It is to be remembered that at daybreak the Valley Army was by no means concentrated. Jackson had with him at Cedarville only Ewell's division, his own division having halted near Front Royal. This last division, it appears from the reports, did not leave Front Royal until 8 a.m., a sufficiently early hour, considering the condition of the men and horses, the absence of the trains, and the fact that one of the brigades had bivouacked 4 miles south of the village. It was not, then, till between 9 and 10 that the column cleared Cedarville, and Middletown was distant nearly 3 hours' march by an exceedingly bad road. In all probability, if Jackson, at daybreak or soon afterwards, had marched boldly on Middletown with Ewell's division, he would have been able to hold Banks on the Valley Turnpike until the rest of his infantry and artillery arrived. But he had always to bear in mind that the Federals, finding their retreat on Winchester compromised, might make a dash for Manassas Gap. Now the road from Strasburg to Manassas Gap was protected throughout its length by the North Fork of the Shenandoah, and to attack the Federals on the march, should they take this road, the Confederates would have to move through Cedarville on Front Royal. This was the only road by which they could reach the river, and the bridges at Front Royal were the only available points of passage. Jackson, it appears, was therefore reluctant to leave Cedarville within easy reach of the bridges until he received information of his enemy's designs, and that information, which had to be sought at a distance, was naturally long in coming. Criticism after the event is easy, but it certainly seems curious, with his knowledge of Banks, that Jackson should have believed his opponent capable of so bold a measure as retreat by way of Manassas Gap. According to his own report, the feasibility of such a course did cross Banks' mind, but it might seem that on this occasion Jackson lost an opportunity through overcaution. Nevertheless, in desperate situations, even the most inert characters are sometimes capable of desperate resolutions. Although for the time being Banks was permitted to extricate his infantry from the toils, the remainder of his command was less fortunate. The general and his brigades reached Winchester in safety, but the road between that town and Strasbourg was a scene of dire disaster. 11:30 a.m. Stuart, with the 2nd and 6th Virginia, had struck Newtown before noon and found a convoy of wagons strung out on the Valley Turnpike. A few shots threw everything into confusion. Many of the teamsters deserted their posts and fled towards Winchester or Strasbourg. Wagons were upset, several were captured, and others plundered. But the triumph of the Confederates was short-lived. The Federal infantry had already reached Middletown, and Banks sent forward a regiment of cavalry and a brigade of infantry to clear the way. Stuart was speedily driven back, and the Northerners resumed their march. 12:15 p.m. At some distance behind the infantry came the Federal cavalry, about 2,000 strong, accompanied by a battery and a small party of Zouaves. But by the time this force reached Middletown, Ashby, supported by the Louisiana Brigade, had driven in the regiment hitherto opposed to him, and, emerging from the forest, with infantry and guns in close support, was bearing down upon the village. The batteries opened upon the solid columns of the Federal horse. The Louisiana regiments, deploying at the double, dashed forward, and the northern squadrons, penned in the narrow streets, found themselves assailed by a heavy fire. A desperate attempt was made to escape towards Winchester, and a whirling cloud of dust through which the sabres gleamed swept northward up the turnpike. But Ashby's horsemen, galloping across country, headed off the fugitives. Some of the Confederate infantry drew an abandoned wagon across the road, and others ran forward to the roadside fences. At such close quarters, the effect of the musketry was terrible. In a few moments the turnpike, which had just before teemed with life, presented a most appalling spectacle of carnage and destruction. The road was literally obstructed with the mingled and confused mass of struggling and dying horses and riders. Amongst the survivors, the wildest confusion ensued, and they scattered in disorder in various directions, leaving some 200 prisoners in the hands of the Confederates. Part dashed back to Strasbourg, where the teeming magazines of the Federal commissaries were already blazing, and part towards the mountains, flying in small parties by every country track. The rear regiments, however, still held together. Drawing off westward in the hope of gaining the middle road and of making his way to Winchester by a circuitous route, General Hatch, commanding the cavalry brigade, brought his guns into action on a commanding ridge about a mile west of the highway, and still showed a front with his remaining squadrons. Infantry were with them. More horsemen came thronging up. Their numbers were unknown, and for a moment they looked threatening. The Confederate batteries trotted forward, and Taylor's brigade, with the Stonewall and Campbell's in support, was ordered to attack, whilst Ashby, accompanied by the Louisiana Tigers and 2 batteries, pursued the train of wagons that was flying over the hills towards Winchester. 3 p.m. The question now to be solved was whether the cavalry was the advanced or the rear guard of the Federal army. No message had arrived from Stuart, but the people of Middletown supplied the information. They reported that in addition to the convoy, a long column of infantry had passed through the village, and Jackson, directing his infantry to follow Ashby, sent a message to Ewell to march on Winchester. Some delay took place before the 3 brigades, which had now driven back the Federal cavalry, could be brought back to the turnpike and reformed, and it was well on in the afternoon when, with the Stonewall regiments leading, the Confederate infantry pushed forward down the pike. The troops had been on their legs since dawn. Some of them, who had bivouacked south of Front Royal, had already marched 16 miles. The Federals had more than 2 hours' start, and Winchester was still 12 miles distant. But the enemy's cavalry had been routed, and such as remained of the wagons were practically without a guard. Ashby and Stuart, with 3 fine regiments of Virginia cavalry, supported by the horse artillery and other batteries, were well to the front, and there was every reason to believe, to use Jackson's own words, that if Banks reached Winchester, it would be without a train, if not without an army. But the irregular organization of the Valley forces proved a bar to the fulfillment of Jackson's hopes. On approaching Newtown, he found that the pursuit had been arrested. 2 pieces of artillery were engaging a Federal battery posted beyond the village, but the Confederate guns were almost wholly unsupported. Ashby had come up with the convoy. A few rounds of shell had dispersed the escort. The teamsters fled, and the supply wagons and sutlers' carts of the Federal army, filled with luxuries, proved a temptation which the half-starving Confederates were unable to resist. Nearly the whole of Ashby's cavalry and a part of the infantry under his command had turned aside to pillage. Indeed, the firing had not ceased in the first onset upon the Federal cavalry at Middletown, before some of Ashby's men might have been seen, with a quickness more suitable to horse thieves than to soldiers, breaking from their ranks, seizing each 2 or 3 of the captured horses, and making off across the fields. Nor did the men pause until they had carried their illegal booty to their homes, which were, in some instances, at the distance of 1 or 2 days' journey. That such extreme disorders could occur, adds Dabney, and that they could be passed over without a bloody punishment, reveals the curious inefficiency of officers in the Confederate army. Banks, when the pursuit had so suddenly ceased, had determined to save the remnant of his train. 3 regiments and a couple of batteries were ordered back from Bartonsville, with Gordon in command, and this rearguard had not only shown a formidable front, but had actually driven the infantry that still remained with Ashby out of Newtown and into the woods beyond. General Hatch, who had regained the turnpike with part of his brigade, had now come up, and the addition of 6 squadrons of cavalry rendered Gordon's force capable of stout resistance. The Federals held a strong position. The Confederates had present but 50 cavalry, 150 infantry, and 5 guns. Nor was there any hope of immediate support, for the remainder of the troops were still several miles in rear, and Stuart's 2 regiments appear to have rejoined General Ewell on the road for Nineveh. Shortly before sunset, the Confederate artillery was reinforced. The Stonewall Brigade had also arrived upon the scene, and Gordon, firing such wagons as he could not carry off, as well as the pontoons, fell back on Winchester as the night closed in. The Confederates had now marched from 16 to 20 miles, and the men had not eaten since the early morning. But Jackson had determined to press the march till he was within striking distance of the hills which stand round Winchester to the south. It was no time for repose. The Federals had a garrison at Harper's Ferry, a garrison at Romney, detachments along the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, and Washington, within easy distance of Winchester by rail, was full of troops. A few hours' delay, and instead of Banks's solitary division, a large army might bar the way to the Potomac. So, with the remnant of Ashby's cavalry in advance and the Stonewall Brigade in close support, the column toiled onward through the darkness. But the Federal rearguard was exceedingly well handled. The 2nd Massachusetts Regiment held the post of honour, and, taking advantage of stream and ridge, the gallant New Englanders disputed every mile of road. At Bartonsville, where the Opequon, a broad and marshy creek, crosses the turnpike, they turned stubbornly at bay. A heavy volley, suddenly delivered, drove the Confederate cavalry back in confusion on the infantry supports. The 33rd Virginia was completely broken by the rush of flying horsemen, the guns were overridden, and Jackson and his staff were left alone upon the turnpike. In the pitch darkness it was difficult to ascertain the enemy's numbers, and the flashes of their rifles, dancing along the top of the stone walls, were the only clue to their position. The Confederate column was ordered to deploy, and the Stonewall Brigade, pushing into the fields on either flank, moved slowly forward over the swampy ground. The stream proved an impassable obstacle both below and above the Federal position, but the 27th Virginia, attacking the enemy in front, drove them back and crossed to the further bank. The pursuit, however, had been much delayed, and the Massachusetts Regiment, although ridden into by their own cavalry, fell back in good order, protected by a strong line of skirmishers on either side of the turnpike. The Confederate order of march was now changed. 3 companies, who were recruited from the district and knew the ground, were ordered to the front. The 5th Virginia, 400 or 500 yards from the skirmish line, were to follow in support. The cavalry and guns were left in rear, and the troops once more took up the line of march. For more than an hour they tramped slowly forward. The darkness grew more intense, and the chaff and laughter, for the soldiers, elated by success, had hitherto shown no sign of fatigue, died gradually away. Nothing was to be heard but the clang of accoutrements, the long rumble of the guns, and the shuffle of weary feet. Men fell in the ranks, overpowered by sleep or faint with hunger, and the skirmishers, wading through rank fields of wheat and clover, stumbling into ditches, and climbing painfully over high stone walls, made tardy progress. Again and again the enemy's volleys flashed through the darkness, but still there was no halt, for at the head of the regiments, peering eagerly into the darkness, their iron-willed commander still rode forward, as regardless of the sufferings of his men as of the bullets of the Federal rearguard, with but one thought present to his mind: to bring Banks to battle, and so prevent his escape from Winchester. The student of Napoleon had not forgotten the pregnant phrase, "Ask me for anything but time." The indiscipline of Ashby's cavalry had already given Banks a respite, and, undisturbed by his reverses, the Union general had shown himself capable of daring measures. Had the Confederates halted at Newtown or at Bartonsville, the troops would doubtless have been fresher for the next day's work, but the morning might have seen Banks far on his way to the Potomac, or possibly strongly reinforced. When the Confederate infantry had met and overthrown their enemy, it would be time enough to think of food and rest. So long as the men could stand, they were to follow on his traces. "I rode with Jackson," says General Taylor, "through the darkness. An officer, riding hard, overtook us, who proved to be the chief quartermaster of the army. He reported the wagon trains far behind, impeded by a bad road in the Luray Valley." "The ammunition wagons?" sternly. "All right, sir. They were in advance, and I doubled teams on them and brought them through." "Ah," in a tone of relief. "To give countenance to the quartermaster, if such can be given on a dark night," I remarked jocosely. "Never mind the wagons. There are quantities of stores in Winchester, and the general has invited one to breakfast there tomorrow." Jackson took this seriously, and reached out to touch me on the arm. Without physical wants himself, he forgot that others were differently constituted, and paid little heed to commissariat. But woe to the man who failed to bring up ammunition. In advance, his trains were left behind. In retreat, he would fight for a wheelbarrow. May 25th. At Kernstown, behind Hog Run, the Federal rearguard halted for the last time, but after a short engagement fell back on Winchester. It was now 3 o'clock, an hour before dawn, and the Massachusetts men became aware that the enemy had halted. Their skirmishers still pressed slowly forward, and an occasional shot flashed out in the darkness. But that noise which once heard on a still night is never forgotten. The solid tramp of a heavy column on a hard road, like the dull roar of a distant cataract, had suddenly died away. As the day broke, the Confederate advanced guard, passing Pritchard's Hill and Kernstown battlefield, struck the Federal pickets on Parkin's Hill. In front was a brook which goes by the name of Abraham's Creek. Beyond the brook rose the ridge which covers Winchester, and Jackson at last permitted his men to rest. The coveted heights were within easy grasp. The Federal army was still in Winchester, and nothing now remained but to storm the hills and drive the enemy in panic from the town. The Confederates, when the order was given to halt, had dropped where they stood and lay sleeping by the roadside. But their commander permitted himself no repose. For more than an hour, without a cloak to protect him from the chilling dews, listening to every sound that came from the front, he stood like a sentinel over the prostrate ranks. As the dawn rose in a quiet undertone, he gave the word to march. The order was passed down the column, and, in the dim grey light, the men, rising from their short slumbers, stiff, cold, and hungry, advanced to battle. Jackson had with him on the turnpike, for the most part south of Kernstown, his own division, supported by the brigades of Scott and Elzey and by 9 batteries. About a mile eastward on the Front Royal Road was Ewell, with Trimble's brigade and 10 guns. This detachment had moved on Winchester the preceding evening, driving in the Federal pickets, and had halted within 3 miles of the town. During the night, Jackson had sent a staff officer with instructions to Ewell. The message, although the bearer had to ride 29 miles by Newton and Nineveh, had reached its destination in good time, and as the Stonewall Brigade moved silently past Pritchard's Hill, Trimble's brigade advanced abreast of it beyond the intervening woods. On both the Valley Turnpike and the Front Royal Road, the Federals were favoured by the ground, and their position, although the two wings were widely separated, had been skilfully selected. On the turnpike and west of it was Gordon's brigade of 4 regiments, strengthened by 8 guns, and by a strong force of cavalry in reserve. Watching the Front Royal Road was Donnelly's brigade, also of 4 regiments, with 8 guns and a few squadrons. The line of defence ran along a broken ridge, lined in many places with stout stone walls, and protected in front by the winding reaches of Abraham's Creek. Still, strong as was the Federal position, there was little chance of holding it. Banks had been joined during the night by the larger portion of his army, and by the garrison of Winchester, but he was heavily outnumbered. At Front Royal and at Middletown he had lost over 1,500 men. Part of his rear guard had scattered in the mountains, and it was doubtful if he could now muster more than 6,500 effective soldiers. In infantry and artillery the Confederates were more than twice his strength. In cavalry alone were they inferior. Jackson's plan of action was simple. His advanced guard was to hold Gordon in position, and when Ewell fell on Donnelly, a heavy column would move round Gordon's right.